All right, it looks like everybody who's going to be here is mostly here. A few stragglers, I'm sure. Welcome to Got Lots of Data, new bulk API for high-volume data loading. First thing to say is if you came here specifically to see Jesper Jurgensen, I am not Jesper Jurgensen. If you need to see Jesper, he is in fact standing up front. But I'm James Ferguson. I'm product management with Salesforce.com. And I have with me Lexi Virapayev as well. And we're going to talk to you about the new API that's in Winter 10 and now available in Winter 10. How many haven't seen this slide before? Okay, so safe harbor statement. Most of what I'll be talking about is public, is GA, is available, documented, etc. Occasionally, and certainly in response to questions, maybe we'll get into roadmap, and so definitely this statement applies. You know, the agenda is pretty straightforward for the next hour. You know, talk about what it is, what it can do for you, how it's different from what you may already know or may already use, and we've got a demo to show it in action, and then talk about what are situations that are applicable for using it, what may or may not be, and sort of what you can expect from it. Let's get a show of hands. How many people are well familiar with this, with loading hundreds of records into Salesforce.com? Right, big hands. How about tens of thousands? Millions? Not too many on the millions? Okay, well, next year when we talk about bulk API, we'll be able to definitely get a show of hands. You know, this has been the way of getting data into Salesforce.com for a number of years. It's on the client side. You might be using the data loader or using the API directly to chop up the data into groups of 200, give or take, or 200 or less. Put it together as a SOAP message, push it up to the cloud. We would process it on the spot and return the results for that 200. You're then responsible for making sure that happens, making sure things don't time out, and then going and looping until you're done. You know, 50,000 rows, it's not hard to do the math. You're doing about 2,500 calls. If you start talking about millions of rows, you're into tens of thousands of calls that you now have to make on the client. And so we started saying, you know, why do we need this bulk API? And, you know, what were the customers, what were you folks telling us about the import process or the API process? Well, first of all, there's just a lot of stuff you need to do on the client. If you're writing the code, it's certainly a bit easier if you're using data loader. But from the API perspective, you know, got to make 5,000 calls in order to do the API. Just the network overhead of making those 5,000 separate calls. You on the client are responsible for taking what might be a million record set, a million row record set, and breaking it up into 200 records or less. And even if you yourself aren't doing it, you've got a SOAP package or some implementation of the SOAP stack that's turning that all into XML, which is not always the most efficient thing. You're doing it on the client side, so it's taking up client resources. We're doing it on the server side to get it back into a structure of data that we can then insert into the database. And so all of that processing is done. Long queries. If you're inserting data that has lots of triggers, that is firing workflows and approval processes that are all doing that, you then have, even for just 200 records, you might have a case where it takes a long time to do that. HTTP connections time out, networks drop. All of those things become issues on the client side that you then have to worry about and tune your batch size in order to eliminate those timeouts. We'll talk about the parallel operations. There was no official formal way of parallelizing, something like that, the import of a million records. Does it need to happen one at a time? Often it doesn't, and there was no good official way of doing that in parallel. And then really from a monitoring perspective, only the person who was at the console kicking off the batch import job or kicking off the custom code that you have was able to see results. And so those are all limitations that we thought, okay, we need to do something about this. What are we going to do in order to resolve this? And it's going to jump forward like five slides, I know. Hello? Lexi, can you do hand puppets of the bulk API? Well, no. I don't, okay, hang on a second. What is, okay. All right, magic. So rather than the current mode of doing everything on the client, pushing it and waiting for a result, what we're saying is let's turn it around. Take big chunks of data, push it all up to Salesforce first, and then let Salesforce churn away at it and do the updates, do the inserts on that. And so really from an API perspective, rather than just having an update method that you then pass a collection of S objects to, what you're doing is rather, it takes a couple of extra steps. You create a job, and that job sort of creates the placeholder within the Salesforce.com infrastructure. You send data files. We'll talk about the limits, but it's 10,000 records at a time. You send in different files, send up to the server, that then get stored. We store it locally in the cloud. I'm not sure if clouds have a locality, but we store it within our data center in a temporary file storage. And so you're able to just push it all up, and then you can poll for status. You're not polling for results. You're not waiting for the process to occur. You're simply checking a status. And meanwhile, on the server side, within the Salesforce.com side, what we're able to do is take those batches, take those 10,000 record batches, and start processing them. We can process them in serial. We can also process them in parallel. And there's basically options in the parameters in the API that define that. And so not only are we able to send all the data at a time, we can actually start the process before all the data is there. So once the first batch is up, the first batch can start to be processed, while the second and third and fourth and fifth and 500th batch is sent up. And so what this really allows us to do is provide the scalability. Provide the scalability. What does it mean? Well, first of all, you're pushing CSV files up to Salesforce through the API. You aren't having to take the CSV file, process it in XML just for us to process it back into something we can use. It's simply CSV, and it is, the CSV in 10,000 records. It can be a 10,001 row CSV file, so one has the headers. Fewer network round trips. Again, it's not hard to do the math, although I'm probably going to get it wrong when I try to do it on the fly. But, 1 million records, that's 100 calls? 110,000 record calls? And so really far fewer round trips. And the round trips are just for transfer. It is not waiting for a long-running transaction to finish before it's returned. A big benefit you get from this model is the monitoring side. So now, not only on the client can you pull for results, but you can go to setup. You can go to the bulk API loads areas of setup and see current jobs that are running, see the progress that those jobs have made so far, see recent jobs that are up there. So you are able to, wherever you are in the world, you can then access through the Salesforce.com interface, you can access the status of those processing. So you may kick it off at midnight or have a process kicked off at midnight, but you don't have to be physically at the desk in order to see the status. You can get updates from home at 2 in the morning instead. And then finally, we can do the parallel processing properly. And what do we mean by, jumping ahead of myself. Actually, I'm not. So this changes the way you do imports, right? Rather than having this very tight loop that's sending data and waiting immediately for those inserts, it's changing it. But it's important to remember that it is not changing a whole lot of things as well. So it is not somehow creating a new set of save logic. The same triggers or workflows that would happen during a standard API, standard web service API call happen. If you're doing administrative actions that involve moving users around a territory hierarchy or reassigning ownership of a large number of opportunities, there are still going to be sharing-related locking going on, administrative locking going on. Side effects, triggers, workflows, all of those things are the same. There is literally no change to that. And so it is important to remember that this is a great new feature, but you get to leverage all of the work that you continue to do. You don't have to worry about a different path. You can have all of that continue to work properly. Parallel processing. So when people have tried to load, or not tried, when people have loaded hundreds of thousands of records with the Web Service API, one of the standard things they think is, okay, well, I've got one client doing 200 at a time. If I get 10 clients, I can get 2,000 at a time, and that will shave time off. And in some cases, that would work. In other cases, where maybe an update of one record caused a lock within a row, maybe account team membership or something, you would start getting contention. You would start getting locks. You would start getting conflicts. And those conflicts would simply be pushed back on to you as a client, to you as a programmer, to do your own retry logic, essentially. And you were, again, putting the burden on you as a developer to handle those error cases. What we can do within ours, so first of all, we're taking these big 10,000 transactions. It can be set to serial mode. If you know there's going to be a lot of contention, that maybe the best result is just push it all up there and let it happen serially. It might take a bit longer, but you're no longer having to sit there and watch it anyways. But what we're able to do is a bit more intelligence within the cloud. So you can see, so if a lock does happen, well, we can just say, okay, well, maybe that's just because it happens at this moment that somebody else, another thread, is executing a conflicting. Let's pause that, put it back on our queue. We're basically maintaining this queue of the jobs that need to be done. And we can retry it at a later date, not a later date, a later time, at some time during the batch, and then keep track of the retries. And so at some point we'll say, okay, well, there's just too many conflicts going here. We're going to return the error. The errors get returned on the client side. Now, often the best result, the best mitigation is simply, okay, we'll go back with this job and do it in serial mode, because then essentially you eliminate those conflicts, you eliminate those locking problems. But overall, the client side is simply is greatly simplified. Again, this is a big push to not only being more efficient in processing, but also simplifying the logic. A big question that often comes up is, I said the save logic's the same, all of the side effects, workflow triggers are the same, but are there differences? Are there things I can do in bulk API that I can't do in the standard web API? Well, obviously the main thing you can do with the bulk API is it's efficient to do millions of records, million of records insert or update into the system. There are currently, we just went GA with this, there are currently things that it's not supporting, things like binary files, null handling is a little different, so there are some adjustments that need to be made, but overall it's a very comparable set and certainly will be, and we're working on expanding this as we go. But really it's very similar. Question you might have, how do I get this thing? How do I get my hands on it? And it's a good answer. It's an easy answer. If you're already using an edition that has API access, which I'm assuming, since you're attending the bulk API session here at Dreamforce, that probably are, then you already have the API. So it's simply a matter of going to the documentation, looking at the interface for it, and taking advantage of it. It is already, there's no setting that needs to be enabled. Data loader, a lot of people use data loader in order to load, to essentially leverage the APIs in order to load data. There is, with the Winter 10 release, a new version 17 of the data loader. Again, it's available. If you go to your application right now and you go to Setup, Data Management, bulk loader, you will see the Apex data loader, and it will be version 17. You don't have a choice on that. the same CSV file processing, parsing that is being used, so we don't expect any issues of oh, my file used to work with the data loader and now it doesn't work with the data loader. We should be in very good shape there. And similarly, the way successes and errors within data loader are presented to you are the same. So really, the difference is we have a few new settings within the API, somewhere in the middle, as I recall. Oh, at the very bottom, of course, added to the bottom. Use bulk API, and do you want it to be in serial mode? Those are some of the things that we are looking, as well as batch size can now be bigger than 200 for those things. And so really this is something that you can easily take advantage of immediately. At this point, we probably want to see it in action. So I'm going to bring Lexi. Lexi can stand up and show it in action.
Hello, my name is... Hello? Well, if the microphone's not working, I'll just speak loudly. So, excuse me. All right, so I'm going to run through a quick scenario. This is actually real data. It's medical provider information that was provided by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and we're gonna basically do a bulk API load of 100,000 records. And no, it's not going to take the 40 minutes that are left in the session. This is 21 fields of actual data, and we're going to be using the data loader version 17, so you can see how this the small changes in the data loader. To enable this, and really just how easy it is to use. Just for a quick show of hands, how many people have used the data loader before? That's pretty cool. All right.
How many people know it is the Lexi loader?
Yeah, I actually was the original author of the data loader back in the day. If we can do that. As my computer is trying to upgrade me to IE7 instead of Firefox. Let's see if I can. Great. That's awesome. I think, yeah. All right, so here's the data load of 17. I'm going to cancel and show, there it is in the background again. Show the settings dialog that we talked about. As you can see at the bottom, if I can scroll this, change the resolution. Ooh. To change the resolution. Anyhow, there is a checkbox at the bottom if your resolution is. There you can see it. This is the bulk API checkbox. You can see that field truncation is grayed out when you have it enabled. Here's how you enable serial mode right here, in case you cannot do a parallel load. So I'm going to log in real quick. And we're going to be loading medical providers, so I'm going to load into the provider object. And it's 100,000 records. The file is actually 116 megabytes, so it takes a little while for the validation to run, as you can tell. It probably takes about a minute, which is funny because it probably takes about 3 minutes to actually load the data. So with the bulk API, it is very CPU intensive. So the faster computer you can have, the faster pipe you have to get the data up, really does make a difference. We had a question? We're actually giving it the batch size. So my batch size on this was actually set to 2,000, so I'm actually going to be giving it 2,000 records at a time. Once this finishes. It does count to the daily API limits, but if you think about that 10,000 batch counts as one transaction. So it counts, but it counts much less.
We'll talk about governor.
Yeah,
the limits and stuff. We can talk about that.
Yeah, there's a separate set of governor limits for the batch API. There we have 100,000 records. I already have a map. But yes, there's a separate set of governor limits for the batch API, so it's not completely unlimited. All right, and here we go. Yeah, we'll see how fast the internet connection is. Oh, and we're going. So right now it's uploading those records and it's processing. The one thing that James did mention is that we now have UI monitoring on the server side. So I've already logged into the org. If I go to setup, and you go down to the monitoring section, at the very bottom you'll see a new section for bulk data load jobs. Now we can see how our job's doing. And right now, let's see.
Right now, so the question was, does this work for downloading too? Right now, this is insert, update, upstart, and something we're looking at in the future is leveraging the same sort of infrastructure for query for export.
Yes. Oh, or does Informatica support this? Informatica is working on a product for this.
Right.
You have to ask them for their exact release dates, but I think they are.
The question was, does Informatica use this? And we unfortunately are not driving their release schedule. And this sort of applies to all of the partners that may be involved. It is available to them, and in fact, Informatica is one that we've been working with or has been working with us early on, and so I believe they are close to actually GA. I know it's been available in a limited release for select customers, but across the world, we can talk about that as we go. There's more slides on it.
So,
how we doing?
So we're about halfway through. It looks like. You can see the other job I ran yesterday. Took 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So it is kind of nice because you can actually kind of see also the throughput that you are getting with the bulk API. Get back to the loader. Yeah, so just about halfway through. So you can see we're at about 1.3 million records per hour right now, which if anyone's done a load for over an hour, it's really hard to hit a number like that. And it also it depends on the bandwidth of this machine right here. Another question? That is less accurate than the rate that you're going to get on the server, just because I know the data loader code there. So it's once it's done, on the server it's going to have the exact numbers of how long it took, and then we'll be able to calculate the actual true rate.
Is there any thought into being able to manage more logic in your jobs, like checking errors, being able to queue the jobs from the UI?
So are you talking about sort of from the data loader perspective, or from the bulk API?
So it's,
Like a Windows schedule or command file or something like that would run on your jobs, running with Windows
yeah.
on a server,
Basically uploading, then having like a delayed processing. Right now there's not, but I do think that's on the roadmap.
So there are some things that are working on, and plus there's something that's in pilot now that we're looking to go GA, which is scheduled Apex, so some things that can kick off those jobs on a scheduled basis, so scheduling within the cloud. So there's a number of different ways we're approaching that in order to make it so it's, again, less client-side management, less client-side administration, which is sort of one of the drivers of this.
All right, we're almost done here. It actually is. It is. It's taking it. One of the things I think where it does gain efficiency is that it keeps that same context. So it doesn't have to kind of recreate all the steps to processing that 200. It can take 200, then take another 200, and take another 200 for the batches.
But triggers will still not be doing 10,000. Would not be.
Yeah, it's still doing 200. So your Apex governor limits are still going to apply.
Yes, so the parameters in terms of things like the serial mode, etc. I mean, the bulk API is a new API. It is a different API. You're not just using update call with different parameters. It's a new API that you're using to create the job, create the batch with the content, the 110,000 records that you're sending up, create multiple batches, and then close the job, which lets it sort of treat it as a unit. So it is a different API, but all of the parameters that you set are parameters on that new API.
But they're available through if I want to create a batch file for the
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what Informatica is using. That's what Ab Initio. That's what all other integration partners. That's what we use.
Oh.
Sorry, what was that? Okay.
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. So your question was, can you repeat the questions?
Yes.
And we will. So you can see the load did finish. It took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I don't know what that comes out to per hour, but that was an actual real load. We can run a report and see that we have 100,000 records in here. And I really encourage everyone to try this at home. It's the best way to kind of get familiar with it and test out the performance that you're going to get. Is just start up data loader or start up another client that is bulk API enabled and just give it a shot. Sign up for a developer org and try it out. And so you can see at the bottom we have of these medical providers by state 100,000 records. So there we go. Back to James.
Are you doing this wirelessly or wired?
This is wired, but I don't know how fast this wired connection is, being that I see a hub with 5 different wires. Yeah, so this laptop is...
So the question was, is this a wireless connection? Is this wired? And this is a wired connection, but it's a convention center wired connection, which may not be as high bandwidth. So just pushing that data up the pipe is likely something that made this 4 minutes instead of 2 minutes. There might have been some client-side pieces. Certainly that initial delay when we brought that CSV file in to begin with, that was because this is a 2-year-old computer, et cetera, not on the bulk load. Yeah.
Is there best practice for the size of your batch? It's max 10,000.
So we'll talk about some of those things, and let's.
Yeah, and the question was, is there a best practice for the size of the batch? And we're going to cover that and kind of go. Oh yeah, so what data loader does is actually take that CSV and it broke it into batches of 2,000. The question was, I just loaded 100,000 records, but if the match batch size is 10,000, how did that happen? And basically what it was doing was it was batches of 2,000, but the job size was 100,000. So there's a concept of a job that these batches are kind of loaded into. Yeah, so there's a separate operation to get the results back. The data loader will actually pull the results back as part of the full load, but it's not necessary for the records to come in. So there's a monitoring process to say where, on the API as well as in the UI, where are my batches, have they been completed, and what's the status? Are they queued up? Are they in process? So I'm going to turn it back to James, and we'll take more questions later.
Yeah, so there were a couple of questions around the limits. As we said, you create a job, and then you upload batches to that job. What are the limits? It's essentially the 500 batches in a rolling 24-hour period is the primary thing. Now, that can be split up over as many jobs as you'd like, or all in one job. Each of those batches, we talked about 10,000 records. There is also a 10 megabyte limit, so if you're loading up really wide things, then you may need a slightly lower limit in order to hit that 10 megabyte file per batch, or 10 megabyte content per batch. The 5 million records a day is purely coming from the math, right? So it's, if you can only do 10,000 records and 500 times in a 24-hour period, you get to the 5 million. Now, this is not a hard limit, and this is something we're looking. This is a new feature, so we aren't. So we're being a bit conservative on this. If you see a need within your organization for loading more than 5 million on a day, this is something we are interested in knowing about. This is something we're interested in talking about, and we can very much adjust some of these limits. We've had people load tens of millions of records, and without having a problem. So this is the default limit. If you're looking to go beyond that, whether you work through support, whether you work through your customer success manager, definitely do that. Don't think that this is a hard stop on this case. There are a few other more minor limit. Well, not more minor. If you're going to hit one of these, it's not minor at all. But things in terms of the size of a field and fields per row and characters in a row, you can see those. These are all sort of parameters that you would need to work within in order to leverage the bulk API. So, there's a question I expect is out there, what does this mean to me? And it's very hard as a general rule for me to stand on the stage to say, this will do X for you. The best way to do it is to try it. If you're already using the data loader for loads, download the new data loader and make sure the switch is flipped, and you will see. If you're loading small amounts, it might not make that much difference. If you're loading big amounts, there's a very, very good chance that you will get advantages. Play with batch size. It says bigger is not always better, and there's a question about that. When might it not be better? Well, if you've only got 10,000 records and you do a 10,000 record batch size, then it will certainly work. You will wait until that whole multi-megabyte file gets pushed up to the server before the first record is processed. If you know you're in that sort of 10,000 range, well, maybe a batch size of 1,000 is the right. And then as soon as the first batch of 1,000 is up there, it will start getting inserted while the rest of the 9,000 is inserted. And as more and more, assuming the upload is faster than the processing, as more and more batches get uploaded and complete the upload, then they can start processing in parallel. And so you can gain throughput in there. It's not always best to leverage the max. Other than that, a lot of the reasons for batch size tunings that used to exist to avoid timeout for long-running transactions, those sort of things you no longer have to worry about. You no longer have to, because again, you're pushing just the data up the pipe, and you're just waiting for that data to transfer. So potentially, if you had a very slow connection or a flaky connection, you may want to do smaller batch size in order to push smaller amounts. But frankly, if you're dealing with large volumes and you've got a flaky network, I would say first try to fix your network, or don't do it from home through the VPN and the wireless and the whatever. Go into the office and kick it off from the office where you've got solid bandwidth. And so basically, try it and see what it does for you. We expect that it will do wonderful things for some of the performance you have, but there are lots of different factors that come into play. If you're using a partner product, if you aren't currently using Data Loader, we talked a bit about Informatica. Well, if you can, try it with the Data Loader. See if you can do a test case and compare the two. It doesn't have to be a heavyweight test. Test in Sandbox, and so you have no impact of your production. Yep.
Just quickly qualify the timeout thing. There was another limit that didn't make any difference because we added it later. A batch has to be processed in less than 10 minutes. So the batch takes 1
Okay, so did everybody hear? There is one other limit in terms of a 10-minute processing time for the batch. So if you're dealing with large-scale sharing ownership changes or hard, very extensive triggers, et cetera, you may need to go a smaller batch size in order to hit that 10-minute mark. Yep. You'll get the 10,000, the 1,000 batch would be backed out, but the others would be inserted. It wouldn't transactionalize across the entire job. If you need it to be that, then you can create a separate job for each batch, and there's a little overhead.
Yeah, similar to the way the API works now, where if one record fails, that record would go in, but everyone else will.
So you're saying within the data loader, it essentially isn't giving you that feedback.
Why do we allow batch sizes of over 10,000, and then B, why don't we allow, why do you have to if a batch fails, you have to reprocess it on the client side when you're keeping track of it on the server side? And so the first answer is there's a concept of a job, and there's a concept of a batch, and the batch max size is 10,000, and a job does not have doesn't have a max size. And so with the API now, it's true. If a batch of that job fails, you're going to have to monitor it on the client side. But the reason why we have this concept of a job and batches is so that one day we can add that type of functionality in. We understand that that is a problem, and we want to be able to have better job management to say, okay, if this batch fails, can I retrieve this batch? Obviously, it came up to the server, you have it. Can I get it back? I think right now we have status monitoring, and this is a new API. As this matures, we're going to have much fuller features, and so that is on the roadmap, and that is a very valid concern, and we're looking to address it in the future. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly the way it's going to look right now, but absolutely, like we want it to make it as easy as possible, and that monitoring in the UI under setup is the first step. This isn't, the bulk API is going to mature. It's going to be enhanced, right? There are certain things, that you can't do, right? There's a question about querying earlier, right? Right now you can export, and we want you to be able to export. It's only insert, update, and upsert right now. So, in future releases, we're gonna definitely spend a lot of resources kind of increasing the functionality of this API.
Right, and I would definitely encourage, if you had specific things you would like to see in a monitor, then something like an ideas that people could vote on and something that could be taken advantage, that we could leverage within the product roadmap would be a perfect example of something that would be great for that. Yeah. So the question is there, or what would be the error if it did timeout, if there was a batch timeout? And the other is, can you play with batch sizes? Are batch sizes fixed? Can you do batch sizes of 2,000 one day and 10,000 another day, and jobs of 50,000 one day and 100,000 the next day? Roughly, that's the two questions. The error message.
And so for the error messages, the way you do get an error message back, but you have to basically pull the status of your batches. So one way we're gaining efficiency is that as soon as you're uploading a batch, you start uploading the next batch right away. You're not waiting for the results. You're not waiting for us to process. So then what you basically have to do is make a call to get what the status of those batches that you'd previously processed. That's where you need to find out that there was an error in a timeout in the processing. And as for batch sizes and size of jobs, it's all configurable up to you. If you saw in the settings of the data loader, it was set to 2,000. You could set that to 1,000. You could set that to 10,000. Yeah. You could set it to really whatever size you want. I think that the data loader only does the same size every time because that's just the functionality that was built in. But you could do 50 in a batch, and then 10,000 in the next batch if you wanted to.
Right. Even within the same job, they can have different batch sizes so you can submit different batches within the same job with different batch sizes. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when you upload and you're waiting for the upload, you get batch IDs back and acknowledgement that the upload succeeded. It waits until it's up there and it's we've stored it safely to return from that call, again, just during the data transmission part. And you get batch IDs back. You get a job ID when you create the job. You get batch IDs when you create the batch and upload the batch. And that becomes the things that you can then pull for job status and batch status. You don't get data errors until it's processed.
So if I understand the mechanism, you were going to say create a import batches, let's say. You created a batches. On Linux, on the number of imports, or okay, so you're looking at the number of jobs. In other words, let's say that the seventh batch.
You find out that the batch failed. Sorry? Oh, sorry. So the question was lengthy, but at the end it turned into the one part of the question is, if you get a large job and one batch fails, can you find out if that batch failed? And you can find out if that batch failed. It's just up to you to then, if you were processing a large CSV file into smaller chunks yourself, you would have to go through and reprocess and find the set or find a smaller set. We're not handing you back the smaller set that says, okay, and then break this up. And so there's a bit more work today that's needed on the client side for managing that. But you can definitely find out what the status of the batch is, both from success and failure. Right. So currently there's no limit on jobs except the implied one that there's a limit on batches, and so you by default have a 500 job limit because you can't create, or you could have more jobs, but they wouldn't have batches, so that wouldn't be all that useful. And so you could create every one as a separate job, I think, and I'm not sure whether that would be more efficient. We could take that talk to Al. So for those of you who didn't hear, the question was Jesper was saying that where this was coming from was likely, knowing the granularity of the results that you're getting back, of the timeouts, of the errors that are results. And it's not at a job level. there is a status at a job level, but it's more, you can get that status at the batch level. So when you retrieve the results, you can know which batches worked, which batches didn't, and reprocess based on that. So while there may not be that many disadvantages to doing it, except for just sort of more work creating a job, there aren't really advantages of creating a new job for every batch. And then you've got sort of multiple things to manage, certainly more things to watch on the monitoring screen. Yeah. Right. So the question was, how does this play with customizations and Apex governor limits? So the triggers and those things will still be executed in 200. So the save logic, remember, the save logic is the same, and so it's going to be happening. So if you can handle 200, if your triggers are bulkified to handle the 200 within the Apex limits, et cetera, then they will continue to work within that. You will be using fewer API calls, most likely, unless you're using a 200 batch size limit, but you're more than likely going to be using fewer limits on that. And if you have something that is just going to, if the batch itself, the one place where it might come in, if the cumulative time of all those 10,000 batches make it last more than 10 minutes, then you may need to shorten the batch or lessen the batch size in order to make that cumulative time taken doing all the triggers for 10,000 records take shorter, so maybe 5,000. That's the main thing, that's the main variable you play with.
It's going to be faster because you're some of the things of not having to wait. The serial mode. Sorry. So the question was, how does the serial mode compare to the old SOAP API? And it's going to be faster. If you think about it, you're not serializing to XML. So that's that's one advantage. You're still not waiting for the results for the processing. You're setting up the batches as soon as you can. On the server side, it's just not. It's only just using one thread and only processing those batches once they're uploaded in serials. That's what the serial mode means. It means like so you're losing a little bit of efficiency on the server side, but you're still going to be more efficient than the traditional SOAP API.
Right. So as we said before, the save logic is going to be the same. So if you have a trigger that takes a second, it's still going to take, if you manage to get one that takes a second, it's still going to be 200 seconds or 10,000 seconds. We aren't changing that part. It is more efficient because we can start before all the data's up, that sort of stuff. We also, it eliminates a lot of the timeouts and other concerns that comes into play. So there still is value even in the serial mode world. So how does the data loader handle a failed batch, like maybe one batch of 10,000 in the middle of the 100,000 record? How is it handled within data loader?
So the way the data loader works is that we tried to make it similar to the way it works currently. So what it's actually going to do is at the very end of the batch, it pulls down all the results. So it's going to pull down all the successes and all of the individual error records. So you're actually going to get a CSV output with every single row that failed. As you can imagine, it's probably going to be fairly big. But we wanted to keep kind of the similar functionality so that there wouldn't be a big transition for new users who are used to using the existing SOAP API and getting those result files to people switching to the bulk API. You'd be able to rely on basically the same output that you're used to getting from the data loader using either API.
And that goes for other partner products too. How they handle errors is going to be obviously in their hands. There's nothing inherent in the API that gives them less information or less ability to provide one set of results or error files or success notifications. That will be up to them to determine it. This was the mode that was taken with the data loader, backwards compatibility first, and so that was our choice. Other partners may choose different. Yes? So there's another session, but I don't know where it is, but you should look for it. There is something that also went GA with Winter 10 called Batch Apex, which essentially lets you go over a 1 million record set. Now, it works similarly in terms of your piece of Apex code gets chunked through at 5,000 at a time, but governor limits get reset, and you basically keep going, and so you can execute the batch apex. In fact, you'll notice, if you may have noticed in that demo, it came up with a very messy state table, and there was some that were normalized, some that weren't, because the next step of this demo is actually to run the batch apex over the 100,000 records that cleans it all up into the 50 two-letter abbreviation. So that's definitely something. It is GA, it is batch apex, it is in the documentation, but there should also be at least one session that refers to it.
And I think it's actually next in 305.
There we go.
You're looking for.
It does bulk API does what it does really well in terms of allowing you to get data up into the Salesforce.com and insert it in a high volume way. But is it going to solve all your problems? It's still going back to the fact that the application logic isn't changing. If the things that are slowing down your imports are related to that logic, whether it's triggers, whether it's you're trying to realign territories through API calls, those things have side effects that that are impacted, that will continue to be there. So it doesn't make those things go away. It still may well be a better thing. If you have long-running transactions, you now no longer have to worry about the client-side timeouts, unless you're really long-running transactions. But in general, you're not worried about the client-side timeouts. So the bulk API may still be the better approach to take on this, so it's definitely worth exploring. But there will be cases where if you're trying to do very heavyweight things, that it might be better to do it on the standard API. And the easiest way to find out is, of course, to try it. Are there new problems? Well, not really. I mean, we talked, there's some different tunings that are needed. We talked about how maybe the 10,000 batch size isn't the right model. We talked about some of the error handling. Maybe the error handling isn't, you want to handle the import in a slightly different way. So it's really new optimizations as opposed to new problems. And so we just sort of threw out this one example. If you're making updates on the account team member, there's certain locking that happens on the account and on the user. And if you were to upload data by account ID, you're fine, because essentially the account, all the users get changed, all of the same account is locked and all the different users get attached to it. However, if you're going in the user, then you're going to be locking accounts all over the place, bouncing that around, and it may be contention. You may start seeing these failures, these retry failures, sending back to the client. And so some of those things are things you really want to look at when you're doing anything, and this is not unique to the bulk API. If you're doing anything against tens, hundreds, millions of rows of data, you want to do it smartly. You want to know what the side effects are, what is happening underneath it, so you can make sure to tune your jobs properly. And so is it dangerous? Well, no, it isn't. Now, that said, would I recommend you going home and loading, or not home, going back to the office, I hope, and uploading 20 million rows of something into your production database? Well, no. I mean, that just wouldn't be smart, even if, even though you can. So, start smaller, start growing. See the behavior both of the API and the system with the data in there. Use the full copy sandbox capability so you can really see what the impact of these will be. We've got to look. You should be looking at the parallel. Often parallel will provide great advantages, but in cases that it don't, you want to know about that. You don't want to be trusting everything to work, the day before you're planned to go live when you've only got a 1-hour window. When you've only got a 1-hour window, you want to know what's going to happen beforehand, and the way you do that is by testing, by using sandbox. And so, try it. Try it with big volumes. It's hard to give exact numbers on this because the business logic that you execute on the insert matters. Because we can parallelize this, it takes advantage of underused capacity. Well, at peak times, there's less underused capacity to take advantage of. Off-peak times, more capacity to take advantage of. And so you'll get different benefits on that. And so definitely something to work with. There are certainly fewer round trips. We see 10x improvement. We've certainly seen, millions of records in an hour uploading. I forget, we were at 1.3 million records in an hour was what that happened off a slow conference center connection, where that was probably the network connection was more than likely the bottleneck on that rather than the server side. So definitely some very big numbers can be seen on that, much bigger, much less painful than you might see already. From, just bottom line, it is now available. It is GA. It is in Winter 10. The new data loader is there. You can download it yourself. It provides not only, the second bullet is really why we're doing it, to allow high volume loads to happen. A side effect happens to be that it becomes much simpler on the client side. It's a much simpler API to use when it comes to this error handling retrying when you're dealing with large volume situations. And it provides this additional capability, this initial dashboard for monitoring the API, or the bulk import jobs, which will give you that. We encourage everybody to use it. As we said, it's not behind a permission. It's not behind a setting that you need to enable. It is available. So we definitely encourage you to both use the data loader as well as use the API itself. We've got a couple more minutes, or learn more. Being part of the product, it is documented. So you can search for bulk API in the documentation, find it. Search for it on developerforce.com. That's there. You can find it within setup itself. And so we have a minute and a half. Yes.
If I have 3 files, A, B, and C, and data points to B and C externally, how do I load them up and maintain that relationship? Now I have to load them, pull back out, key them, load them, pull them back out, key them. So I have file A, and file A points to file B on a primary key, which is an external primary key, which also points to file C. How do I bulk load all 3 into customized objects and maintain and have them generate proper limits?
That's more of a logical question than a bulk API question, but we can still handle it. So basically, if I have 3 different files with foreign keys that are related to each other, how do I basically get those two linked to each other? Probably the best way to do it is there's a custom field type called external ID, which you can then use the upsert call to match. So you load in your file A.
That loads the first file and
Yeah.
there. But how when file A has a pointer of that external ID to another file, to another object?
So object B though has the same value in that external ID as A, right?
Maybe let's take
Okay, I'll take that one offline, but we can try to diagram it. I think there is a way using the upsert call probably to accomplish that.
Yep. Okay, let's. Are there any before I? Well, let's talk about this offline. And are there other questions on the bulk API?